The True Kings of Matter, Book 1, The Stag of Sedrilar. Chapter 1, The Stag Beneath the Royal Trees. And there it was in all its splendor, the stag, its appearance here. This nation, it seems that its time has come. Elowyn said the words before she knew she had spoken. They slipped from her lips in the old manner, low and careful, shaped by the same fear her mother had carried and her mother before her, and every keeper of the bound book before their names were swallowed by graves. She had not meant for Cale to hear them. She had not meant for anyone to hear them. Yet the words had already crossed the air, and once spoken, they belonged to the room. Her son turned toward her. He was 14, tall for his age, still narrow in the shoulders, still trying to stand as if the sword at his hip had made him a man. The blade was plain, too long by a finger for his reach, and its leather grip had hardly darkened from use. He had been given it 3 weeks ago by an old guard who pitied widows and believed boys learned faster when metal hung at their side. Cale wore it as if it burned him. He touched the hilt whenever nobles passed too near, then dropped his hand when they looked at him. Now his fingers found it again. "Mother?" he whispered. Elowyn did not answer. Her eyes remained fixed upon the high window at the far end of the feasting hall. Beyond the glass, past the lantern glow in the carved balcony, past the hanging moss that fell from the eaves in long green veils, something stood beneath the royal trees. The stag. It was not a flame. That was what her first terror corrected inside her. The old stories had always used the word blaze, and foolish listeners made pictures of burning animals, of holy beasts wreathed in colored fire, of antlers smoking like torches, of fur crackling under impossible heat. But the blaze did not belong to the body. It belonged to the eyes. The creature's body was dark and still, shaped with the severe beauty of an old forest thing that had never known fear of arrow, wolf, winter, or man. Its fur was deep brown, almost black where the moonless sky pooled against it. Its neck was strong, its chest was broad, its legs were slender but not fragile, placed among the roots with royal patience. Its antlers rose high above its head, branching in pale arcs like a crown grown from bone in tree memory. Its eyes burned, green and purple, not like lamps, not like jewels catching candlelight. They held the look of fire seen through deep water, two strange flames trapped behind the living gaze of a watching god. Green moved through them first, bright as spring leaves under stormlight. Purple followed behind it, rich and bruised, the color of royal cloth left too long in a tomb. The stag looked toward the castle, toward the feast, toward the crown. Elowyn felt the book under her clothing grow cold against her ribs. It lay wrapped beneath her bodice and inner cloak, bound in blackened leather, clasped in dull metal that never warmed to the hand. It was small enough to hide, though heavy in the way sacred things are heavy, carrying more than their size allows. Her mother had called it a mercy. Her grandmother had called it a debt. Her uncle, who had died coughing blood into a basin of cedar water, had called it one of the 8 wounds left open in the mortal world. The True Kings of Matter, one of 8 mortal copies, 8 books, 8 bloodlines, 8 families that survived by knowing when to leave before nations became graves. Elowyn had never liked that thought. Survival sounded noble until one understood what it required. A family that lived through endings became a family full of departures. They did not save towns. They did not stop kings. They did not command the beings who appeared in the old pages. They ran when the book grew cold. They carried children through smoke. They buried names in other people's soil and taught the next generation to listen for signs. Her family had kept its copy through fire, famine, false trials, and 3 forgotten border wars. Then fever took them. One by one, they died in the wet spring 17 years ago, leaving Elowyn with the book, her mother's last breath, and a command that had never stopped sounding inside her. When the eyes of a king of matter find your age, do not ask whether it has come to punish or pity. Gather what blood remains yours. Leave before wonder becomes law. The feasting hall roared around her, alive with music and polished voices. Sedrilar, jewel of the tree lands, had gathered beneath the roof of High Root Castle to honor King Thavrin's 60th year upon the living throne. The castle had been raised in the oldest woodland of the nation, though raised was not the right word. It had been carved, coaxed, bound, and grown across centuries. Stone foundations gripped the hill, but the upper halls curved through living trunks wider than towers. Root and wall interlaced. Staircases spiraled through hollowed cedar chambers. Windows opened between branches. Balconies hung over courtyards where silver leaves fell even in summer. High Root Castle was the pride of Cedrilar. Bards called it the palace that breathed. Foreign ambassadors bowed when they entered because the very air smelled holy, thick with resin, old leaves, and rain trapped in wood. The throne room was cut around the heart of an ancient tree said to have drunk from the first river of Vorengard. In that room, the royal seat grew from the roots themselves, and every king of Sidrilar placed his hand upon its arm before speaking law. The feast hall was younger than the throne chamber, but only by the measure of old kingdoms. Its ceiling was a canopy of shaped beams, each one carved with stags, wolves, birds, mothers holding infants, sons kneeling before fathers, daughters carrying bowls of grain, kings receiving crowns from the forest. Green banners hung between the beams. Gold-threaded leaves adorned the walls. Tables stretched from one side of the hall to the other, each covered in white cloth and set with silver. Dark wine, honeyed fruit, roast boar, river fish, black bread, bowls of winter nuts, and cakes shaped like crowns. Everything had been arranged to say Cedrilar endured. Everything had been polished to hide the opposite. Elowyn knew the castle too well to believe its beauty. She had served inside High Root since Cale was 5, first as a linen woman, then as a chamber attendant, then as a quiet pair of hands trusted in places where noble speech became careless. She was not a servant born to the castle, but a widow with careful eyes and a reputation for silence. Silence fed children better than pride. Silence opened corridors. Silence made nobles forget she had ears. Because of silence, she knew where the cracks had formed. King Thavrin was dying, not at once. Cedrilar preferred long endings. The king had faded over 3 years, each season stealing some warmth from him. Once he had ridden beneath the great trees with a hawk on his wrist and a laugh that could fill a courtyard. Now he sat at the central table on a chair brought from his private chamber because the throne roots hurt his back. His skin looked like pale bark. His beard had thinned to silver wisps. His fingers trembled around his cup. Rings hung loose on him, great emeralds and branch gold bands that seemed to belong to a larger man. He had refused to name a successor. That refusal had become a sickness. Cedrilar had 5 living claimants close enough to the crown to stain the floor for it. Prince Valor, the eldest son, sat nearest the king, handsome, rigid, grave, with the expression of a man who had practiced grief in a mirror. His wife, Lady Marith, wore green silk embroidered with pale antlers. She watched every cup poured near him. Princess Sarion sat across from him, dressed in white and gold, her hair braided with pearls. Her smile had the tenderness of a blade wrapped in cloth. She had married into the river houses but returned to court when the king weakened, claiming only daughterly devotion. She had brought 30 armed retainers. Prince Audrin, the king's second son, laughed too loudly at the lower table, surrounded by younger knights, hunters, and men who enjoyed seeing fear in other people. He had a red face, clever hands, and debts in half the Western holdings. Lady Elira, niece to the king through his dead sister, sat with the priestly judges. She had the strongest legal claim if Valor and Audrin were proven unfit, and she carried herself like someone who had already written the necessary proof. Then there was young Prince Aurel, the king's grandson, barely 7, hidden somewhere in the nursery wing, under old knights and nursemaids. A child could not rule alone, which made him useful to everyone who wished to rule through him. 5 claimants. 5 knives wrapped in green cloth. Cale had asked about them that morning while Elowyn fastened his belt. Which one will be king? She had tightened the buckle, perhaps harder than needed. The one Cedrilar survives. That is not an answer. It is the answer kingdoms give when they are afraid. He had frowned at that, not understanding and hating that he did not understand. At 14, his mind had begun to bruise itself against adult things. He wanted straight roads, named enemies, clean choices. He wanted evil to bare its teeth and good men to draw steel in time. Elawan loved him too much to let him keep such easy hopes, but she had also loved him too much to crush them before the world did. And now the world had come to the window with green and purple in its eyes. "Mother," Cale said again, quieter. Elowen reached for his hand under the table linen and squeezed once. "Do not point," she whispered. "I saw it first." "I know. What is it?" The music swelled. Flutes, low drums, and cedar harps filled the hall, while servants moved between tables, carrying trays of spiced pears and cups of black wine. Laughter rose from the western branch lords, where Lord Saren of Mosswater had finished some crude joke. A priest near the king dabbed at his lips. Princess Sarian leaned close to Lady Elira and said something that made both women smile without warmth. The stag stood outside unnoticed by most, or perhaps noticed and denied. "That," Elowen said, "is something my mother prayed I would never see." Cale swallowed. His hand remained on his sword. "You know it. I know stories of it." "From the book?" Elowen's fingers tightened around his. "Lower your voice." His eyes flicked toward the nobles nearest them. They had been seated at one of the lesser service tables along the wall, close enough to answer if summoned, far enough to be forgotten. Elowen's place was not among the royal blood, but the king's steward had wanted trusted attendance in the hall. Cale had been allowed beside her because the castle had become dangerous in quiet ways, and Elowen had begged the steward not to leave the boy in the servant dormitories where drunk guards might wander after midnight. The steward, old Rem Vale, had stared at the sword on Cale's hip and sighed. "Can he use that?" "Better each week," Elowen had lied. "Better each week is how boys die." "Then let him sit where I can keep him from needing it." Rem Vale had allowed it because he owed Elowen 3 favors, and because he feared the feast would become a place where mothers searched for sons afterward. Now Rem Vale stood behind the king's chair, thin as a broom handle, face drawn tight. Had he seen the stag? Elowen could not tell. The old steward's gaze was fixed on the cups. The cups mattered. At royal feasts, cups always mattered. Cedrilar's bloodline had produced saints, tyrants, poets, cowards, and 3 kings remembered mainly for how they died after drinking. The nation's songs made such deaths sound elegant. They used phrases like cup taken, wine quieted, feast felled. Elowen hated those phrases. Poison was not poetry to the body. It was panic, spit, swelling, clutching hands, purple veins, and breath turning into an animal trapped in the throat. She looked again at the stag. Its eyes remained bright, green and purple. The blaze did not flicker. It watched with unbearable steadiness. "Tell me what it means," Cale said. Elowen breathed slowly through her nose. She remembered her mother's kitchen, the smell of stewed roots, the rain tapping on shutters. She remembered being 10 years old and sitting at a table while her mother opened the bound book for the first time. The pages had looked too thin to survive touch. Her mother's hands had trembled above them, though not from age. "There are 7 beneath the black moon," her mother had said. 7 watchers, 7 signs, 7 crowned creatures and shapes of matter. Some call them archons. Some call them the true kings. The book calls them both and neither. "Are they gods?" Elowen had asked. Her mother had looked toward the shuttered window as if gods might dislike careless answers. "They are near enough that the difference will not comfort you." Years later, when fever had eaten the house, Elowen's mother had pressed the book against her chest and spoken with lips cracked from thirst. "If the stag comes, leave crowns to crown seekers. If the owl comes, flee the kind of wisdom that weighs bodies against arguments. If the serpent comes, mistrust sweetness offered with ink. If the eagle comes, hide from clean hands above maps. If the bear comes, break bread before it is locked away. If the fox comes, burn contracts that make betrayal lawful. If the man comes, run from anyone who claims purity can be measured." "What of the demiurge?" Elowen had whispered. Her mother had wept then, though the fever had left her too dry for tears. "If the black moon opens over you, child, then every road has already become a question." Elowen blinked herself back into the feast hall. The stag remained outside. Kale waited. She gave him what truth she could without breaking him in the middle of the hall. The stag appears near crowns, she said, near succession, near inheritance, near families that begin counting blood as if blood were coin. Kale looked toward the royal table. They are already doing that. Yes. Then it came because of them. Perhaps. Or because of what they will do. Perhaps. He frowned. You hate that word. I do. Then why use it? Because the book does. At the center table, King Thavern lifted one hand. The music softened at once. Every conversation diminished into a courtly hush. Chairs scraped, cups lowered, servants stepped back. The feast hall turned its 1,000 eyes toward the old king. Thavern struggled to stand. Prince Valor rose quickly to help him. Too quickly, Eloin thought. A show of devotion, angled for witnesses. Odrin watched from his place with a half-smile. Sariani's eyes dropped to the king's hand on Valor's wrist. Elira watched the priestly judges, measuring who noticed what. The king reached his feet. For one moment, Eloin saw what he had been. Not the shaking frame, but the shape beneath it. A man who had ruled a forest nation with enough force to keep proud houses kneeling. A man who had buried enemies under law rather than earth when possible, though he knew how to use both. A man who had once held Sidrialar together because he understood that every noble in the realm loved the kingdom less than their own branch of it. His voice, when it came, was thin but clear. My children, he said. The hall bowed its head. Blood of my blood, root of my root, sworn friends of Sedrilar, chiefs of the elder groves, wardens of the rare tree lands, priests of the living chapel, keepers of law, keepers of seed, keepers of blade. Tonight we feast beneath the branches that bore our fathers. Tonight we remember that a kingdom is not held by crown alone. Eloin felt Kale's shift beside her. The old king paused. His eyes moved across the hall, stopping upon each claimant long enough for discomfort to stir. A crown, Thavern continued, is a small thing. It is metal and memory. It is weight accepted by one skull for the sake of many. Prince Odrin's smile faded. Princess Sarian folded her hands. Valor lifted his chin. The king leaned more heavily on the chair. I have heard whispers. I have heard prayers made too loudly. I have heard servants beaten for answers their masters were too cowardly to ask in daylight. I have heard old laws recited by those who sharpen knives while speaking them. A few faces changed. Most did not. Thavern coughed, and the hall held still while he gathered breath. Outside, the stag lowered its head slightly, as if listening. The king said, I will name my heir before dawn. The hall did not erupt. Sedrilar's nobles had been trained too well for open hunger. Instead, silence clenched. Eloin felt it move through the room like a hand closing around a throat. Before dawn. That meant every claimant had one night to prevent every other claimant from living to hear the name. King Thavern raised his cup. Until then, we remain Sedrilar. Cups lifted. All around the hall, wine darkened silver rims. Alowin did not touch hers. Kale noticed. You are not drinking? Neither are you. I was not given wine. Good. The king drank. Every eye watched whether he would fall. He did not. A breath passed through the hall, almost laughter, almost disappointment. Then the feast resumed, but altered. The music returned too brightly. Conversations restarted with polished caution. Servants moved faster. Guards stood closer to doors. Every cup became a question. Every smile became work. Eloin kept her gaze on the window. The stag had not moved. A figure stepped into her view, blocking part of the glass. It was Lord Marion of the South Bow, a broad man with gold rings braided through his beard. He had left his table and approached Princess Sarian with a bow that looked respectful from far away. Eloin could not hear his words, but she saw Sarian's face remain gentle while her eyes sharpened. Marion handed her a folded slip of pale bark paper. Sarian accepted it. Across the hall, Valor saw. His jaw tightened. Odrin saw Valor seeing. Elira saw all three. The stag watched beyond them. Alowin thought of a passage from the book. one her mother had made her recite until she hated the sound of it. When the stag stands outside the hall, the first wound has already been chosen. The second wound is choosing itself. The third sits smiling, unaware that its name has entered another mouth. The book was not prediction in the simple sense. It rarely said who would die. It never gave the mercy of dates. It spoke in patterns, in hungers, in symbols that became obvious only when it was too late to be wise. Kale leaned closer. Do you have it with you? Elwyn glanced down at him. The book? He nodded. Yes. Here. Yes. Why? Because I learned not to leave it alone. He looked troubled by that, as if the book were a sleeping animal that might wake in their room. Does it know things? Elwyn almost answered like a mother, with comfort, with soft falsehood, with a hand over a candle before a child could see the knife beside it. Instead, she told him what her own mother had told her, because some fears were safer when named. It notices things before we can. Like the stag? Yes. Did it bring the stag? No. The word came sharp, and she softened her voice at once. The book does not summon. It does not rule. It survives. That is its gift and its cruelty. Kale looked at the window again. The stag's eyes burned through the night. Why only 8 copies? Elwyn had asked that question many times across her life. She had asked it as a child, as a bride, as a widow, and as a mother holding a feverish son through a winter when she thought the book might outlive him too. She had never found an answer that satisfied anything human. Some say there were more, she said. Some say 8 was the number allowed to remain. Allowed by who? The book does not say. The demiurge? She looked at him quickly. Do not say that name loudly in a royal hall. Kale's face tightened. It was the face boys made when corrected in fear rather than anger, shame, irritation, confusion. He was still young enough to believe names were only sounds. Elwyn wished he could remain that young. A servant girl passed near them carrying a dish of sugared nuts. She was perhaps 16, with a round face and frightened eyes. One of Prince Audrin's hunters caught her by the sleeve and pulled her backward, laughing as nuts spilled across the floor. His companions chuckled. The girl bowed her head, apologizing for what he had caused. Audrin saw and did nothing. Kale's hand went to his sword again. Elwyn caught his wrist. Leave it. He grabbed her. I saw. He cannot just do that. In this hall tonight, he can do worse. The girl gathered the spilled nuts with shaking hands. The hunter bent and whispered something in her ear. She flinched. Then a senior servant appeared and ordered her away, before the hunter could make more sport of her fear. Kale's mouth had gone pale with anger. Elwyn leaned closer. Listen to me. You carry that sword to keep breath in your body and mine. You do not carry it to correct the world. His eyes flashed. Then what is the use of carrying one? The question hurt because it deserved a better world than the one that could answer it. Before Elwyn could speak, the hall's great doors opened. A cold draft entered. The banners stirred. Every candle flame bent toward the tables, then straightened. A line of late arrivals crossed the threshold. Tribal chiefs from the northern treelands, their cloaks damp from rain. They wore crowns of carved horn and green cord rather than metal, and their guards carried long axes meant for fighting in close woods. At their center walked Chief Arveth of the Moss Antler tribes, an old man with one eye filmed white and the other black as wet bark. His arrival had not been expected. Elwyn heard murmurs travel down the tables. The Moss Antlers were not invited. They never come this far south. Did the king summon them? Look at their axes. Look at Arveth's sons. King Thavern's face did not change, but his hand tightened on the chair. Prince Valor stood. Chief Arveth, he called, voice smooth and cold, Cedralar is honored by your presence, though the road seems to have confused the hour of welcome. Arveth gave him a smile full of old teeth. The road did not confuse us, Prince. It was your father's silence that lengthened it. The hall stirred more loudly. Audrin laughed once under his breath. Valor's wife touched his sleeve. Princess Sarion's gaze moved from Arveth to the king, then to the guards near the doors. Chief Arveth walked forward without waiting for permission. His men followed until the king's guards barred them with crossed spears. The old chief raised one hand and his son stopped. He bowed to King Thavren. It was a shallow bow, but it was given. Great king, Arveth said, my people heard that Cedralar's root would be named before dawn. Thavren's voice carried weariness and warning. Your people hear more than they are sent. We hear what concerns our blood. You have given me neither son nor daughter in marriage. Arveth's smile faded. My sister's daughter bore your brother a child before your brother died in a hunting accident no hunter in the northern groves believed. That child's child lives. Do not pretend the royal root has never touched our soil. A new silence fell. This one had teeth. Kale whispered, what does that mean? It means another claim, Elowen said. Can they do that? They just did. Chief Arveth reached into his cloak. Half the guards in the hall tensed. He drew out a strip of bark cloth, old and sealed with green wax. Blood oath, he said, witnessed by 3 priests, 1 dead king, and the trees your house claims to honor. The moss antler line has a branch in the royal root. If succession is spoken tonight, we will be heard. Valor's face hardened. This is not a council. Arveth turned his one clear eye on him. That is why we came armed. The old king slammed his cup down. The sound cracked across the hall. Enough. He did not shout it. His body could not support shouting. Yet the word carried the memory of command. And the hall obeyed for a moment because memory can rule even after strength begins to fail. Thavren looked at Arveth. You come into my hall on a night of peace and speak of old wounds. Arveth answered, old wounds open when crowns pass over them. The stag moved outside, only a single step. Elowen saw it. The motion was so slow it seemed more like the forest had adjusted around the animal. One hoof shifted over a root. Its head turned slightly toward the hall's open doors. Its eyes brightened. Green and purple blaze deepened until the glass reflected them across the feast hall. A few people finally noticed. One of Odrin's hunters went quiet. A priest near the west wall made a warding sign, then hid his hand inside his sleeve when Lady Elira looked at him. The servant girl who had spilled the nuts dropped her empty tray. The sound rang too loudly. King Thavren turned toward the window. For the first time, his face truly changed. He knew. Elowen saw it in the old king's eyes. Not full knowledge, perhaps. Kings collected warnings the way their treasuries collected old coins. Maybe he had heard a priest whisper of the stag. Maybe his mother had told him a nursery terror. Maybe every crowned house had some private version of the story, polished into superstition, so they could laugh at it until the night it stood outside. Thavren stared at the stag. The hall followed his gaze. All courtly pretense thinned. The animal stood beneath the royal trees, rain misting around its dark body. Its antlers rose like a pale judgment. Its eyes, green and purple, burned with silent attention. Someone whispered, forest spirit. Another said, omen. A third, more foolish or more frightened, said, blessing. Elowen nearly laughed at the cruelty of that hope. Blessing was the first lie people told when terror looked beautiful. Chief Arveth lowered his head, not in worship, in recognition. Prince Audrin stood from his bench, swaying slightly from wine. His face had gone redder, and his grin had returned too wide. Well, he said, voice carrying farther than courtesy allowed, if the forest came to watch, let it watch Cedralar choose a man, not a corpse in a chair. Several people gasped. Valor turned on him. The king seemed to shrink. Odrin lifted his cup toward his father. I speak plainly because everyone else here is choking on honey. You should have named me years ago. Valor has the courage of a locked chest. Sirion married out and came crawling back when she smelled inheritance. Elira reads law because she cannot inspire men. Oral is a child. And now Arveth drags old rutting stories through our hall as if a forest girl's bastard line deserves cedar and crown. Arveth's sons reached for their axes. The king's guards lowered spears. Valor's hand moved toward his dagger. Sirion smiled faintly, as if watching a door open for her. Elowen grabbed Kale's arm under the table. Stay low. But nothing has happened. Everything has happened. Odrin drained his cup and threw it onto the table. It bounced, rolled, and fell, spilling a dark crescent of wine onto the floor. The crescent looked like a black moon. Elowen's breath caught. The book beneath her cloak pulsed once with cold. Kale felt her stiffen. "What is it?" She did not answer. She was hearing her mother again, voice thinned by fever. When symbols gather without being arranged, leave. When wine becomes moon, when roots become veins, when crowns appear in spilled blood, leave. Leave before the pattern finishes speaking. But the hall was full of soldiers. The great doors stood behind Arveth's men. Side passages were watched by servants loyal to different houses. The castle had become a box full of claimants, and Aloan sat inside it with her son, a hidden book, and an omen at the window. King Thavrin's voice came slowly. "Odrin." The prince looked at him. "Sit down." For one strange moment, Elowen thought he might obey. Then Odrin laughed. It was not drunken laughter, not entirely. It was the sound of a man discovering that the fear he had carried for years had hardened into contempt. "You have sat long enough for all of us," Odrin said. The old king closed his eyes. The hall seemed to hold its breath for the blow that would follow. But Vylor spoke first. "Brother," he said, softly enough that everyone leaned inward to hear, "if you wish to shame yourself before the whole realm, you should have warned us. We could have seated you with the entertainers." Odrin's grin vanished. There it was, Alowan thought. Not the first wound. One of the wounds that had always waited. Odrin moved toward Valor. Guards intercepted him. Odrin shoved one aside. Valor stepped back, not from fear, but to make the approach look worse in every witness's eyes. "See," Valor said to the hall, "this is the man some whisper should inherit Cedralar, a drunk with debts, a hunter of servant girls, a creature who mistakes volume for strength." Odrin struck him. The slap rang out across the hall. It was almost childish. It was also unforgivable. Valor touched his cheek. His wife stood. Chief Arveth began to laugh, low and bitter. Lady Elira turned to one of the priestly judges and murmured something. The judge nodded without meaning to, then caught himself. Princess Syrian watched her brothers with luminous calm. King Thavrin trembled. The stag watched. Kale whispered, "Should we go?" "Yes," Elowen said. The answer left her before the path appeared. She rose carefully, keeping one hand on Kale's shoulder. Around them, others were too fixed on the royal table to notice. Elowen moved like a servant carrying an errand, not like a woman fleeing prophecy. She had learned years ago that panic draws eyes while purpose allows passage. They slipped from the side of the lesser table. Kale walked beside her, stiff with the effort not to look back. "Do not run," she whispered. "I am not." "You want to?" "Yes." "Good. Keep wanting. Do not obey it yet." They passed behind a row of musicians. One cedar harpist had stopped playing entirely, hands resting on the strings. Her eyes were on the window. She had tears on her face. Alowan wondered what story the woman knew. Every family had fragments. Every nation buried old warnings in lullabies, feast songs, festival mass, harvest rites. Then people laughed at them because laughter was easier than obedience. At the archway leading to the eastern service corridor, a guard stepped in front of them. He wore Valor's green shoulder knot. "Where are you going?" Elowen bowed her head. "To fetch clean linen, sir. The spilled wine near Prince Odrin's table will stain if left." The guard looked at Kale. "With a boy carrying steel? My son serves where I serve. Looks old enough to stand watch. He is young enough to drop a tray if shouted at." Kale bristled, but she pressed her heel lightly against his foot. The guard's gaze lingered on her face, then moved down, briefly, lazily. Elowen kept still. She knew the small humiliations that could purchase survival. She had bought bread with them often enough. Behind them, Odrin's voice rose again. The guard glanced toward the hall. That glance saved them. Elowen took Kale's sleeve and moved past. They entered the corridor. Only then did she let herself breathe. The eastern service corridor curved along the outer wall of the feast hall. It was narrow, paneled in dark cedar, lit by resin lamps set into iron brackets shaped like leaves. Servants used it to move dishes from kitchen to hall without crossing the noble's view. Tonight it was strangely empty. Too empty, Kale noticed. Where is everyone? Listening? To them? To their masters? "What do we do?" "Get to my chamber. Take the book's wrapping cloth. Your cloak, food if there is time. Then the lower garden door. The one near the root chapel? Yes. That door is locked after feast bells. I have a key. He looked at her. You have a key to the lower garden door? I have keys to many things people forget women need to survive. A sound came from behind them. A soft step. Elowen stopped. Kale stopped too, a half-breath late. A boy stood at the far turn of the corridor. Not a child, but younger than Kale by perhaps 2 years. He wore the green and silver livery of the royal household, and his face was wet with sweat. In his hands, he carried a covered cup on a silver tray. He froze when he saw them. Elowen knew him. Tavin, a kitchen runner. His mother had once traded mending work with Elowen. He had a scar near his ear from falling against a hearthstone as a toddler. Tavin, Elowen said carefully. The boy's eyes darted toward the hall. Go back, he whispered. What are you carrying? He shook his head. Go back. Kale looked at the covered cup. Elowen took one step forward. Tavin backed away. They told me it was medicine. Who told you? They said the king needed it after speaking. Who? He began to cry. That frightened Elowen more than an answer. Tavin, she said, set the tray down. I cannot. Yes, you can. They have my sister. The corridor seemed to narrow around them. Kale's hand moved toward his sword. Elowen held out one hand, palm down, warning him. Who has your sister? She asked. Tavin tried to speak. Behind him, another figure stepped into the corridor, a man in dark green court clothing, not armor, one of Lady Alera's legal attendants. Elowen had seen him at the law tables, always standing behind her chair, always smiling as though every word in the world could be rearranged to serve him. His name was Vesker. He looked at Elowen, then at Kale, then at Tavin. Tavin, Vesker said softly, you have delayed. The boy flinched. Elowen placed herself slightly in front of Kale. Vesker smiled. Elowen, is it? Linen woman, chamber attendant, widow of the South Cottages. She hated that he knew all of that. My lord, she said, though he was not a lord. Not lord, clerk, advocate on generous days. Tonight, perhaps merely a servant of continuity. His eyes moved to the cup. The king's strength fails. Lady Alera sends a restorative. Elowen said nothing. Vesker's smile thinned. You have served in this castle long enough to understand that questions are dangerous near royal illness. I asked none, but you listened. Kale drew his sword. The sound of the blade leaving the sheath seemed painfully loud in the narrow corridor. Vesker looked amused. It was the wrong reaction. A man who fears a sword steps back. A man who smiles at one has already placed other weapons nearby. Brave, Vesker said, or recently trained. The two are often mistaken for one another. Elowen touched Kale's arm. Put it away. The boy did not. Vesker tilted his head toward Tavin. Bring the cup. Tavin stood trembling. Tavin, Elowen said, look at me. The boy did. If you carry that into the hall, whatever happens will not leave you. Even if they spare your sister, it will sit inside you. Vesker sighed. Such heavy words for a cup. Elowen's gaze never left Tavin. My family carried heavier things. For the first time, Veskar's expression changed. Only slightly. A tightening around the eyes. What family? Elowen realized the mistake at once. The book under her cloak seemed to grow colder, as if warning had become touch. From the hall came a roar. Not one voice, many. Something had happened. Vesker turned his head. Kale moved. It was instinct, fear, courage, foolishness, love, all the unfinished pieces of boyhood striking at once. He lunged forward, sword aimed not at Vesker's chest, but at the tray in Tavin's hands. The blade struck silver. The cup flew. It hit the wall and burst open. Dark liquid splashed across the cedar panels. Where it touched the wood, the varnish blistered. Tavin screamed and dropped the tray. Vesker's smile vanished. The clerk drew a narrow knife from his sleeve and stepped toward Kale with shocking speed. Elowen grabbed the resin lamp from its bracket and hurled it at him. The lamp struck Veskar's shoulder, shattered, and spilled burning oil across his sleeve. He cursed, staggering back, beating at the flame. Kale stood frozen, sword still extended. "Move!" Elowen snapped. This time he obeyed. She seized Tavin by the collar with her free hand and dragged him with them as they ran down the corridor. Behind them, Vesker shouted for guards. The feast hall roared again. A bell began to ring, once, twice, then again and again, wild and uneven. Kel ran beside her, face pale, sword in hand. "What did we do? We kept poison from the king. Was that good?" Elowen almost answered yes. Then she thought of the stag. She thought of the book. She thought of how one spared life could sharpen another murder. "I do not know," she said. They reached the turn leading toward the linen stairs. Tavin stumbled, sobbing. "My sister!" Elowen stopped so hard Cale nearly struck her back. The boy looked at her with terror too large for his face. "They said they would cut her hands if I failed." "Where is she?" "Lower pantry, I think. Odrin's men brought her there, but the lady's clerk came after. I do not know who has her now." Cale looked at Elowen. The question was plain. Save the girl or flee. The book was cold against Elowen's chest. Her mother's command was colder. Gather what blood remains yours. Leave. But Tavin's mother had once sat by Elowen's hearth after Cale's father died. She had brought broth, thread, and quiet company. In a world of nobles, such debts mattered more than law. Elowen closed her eyes for one heartbeat, then opened them. "Cale, listen. We go to the lower pantry. We take the girl if she is there. Then we leave by the garden door." His face changed, fear and pride warring in him. "What if there are men?" "There will be men. Then why are we going? Because if we leave every child behind, survival becomes another kind of rot." Taven wept harder. Elowen gripped his shoulders. "You know the pantry passages better than I do. Lead." The boy nodded too quickly. They moved. The castle had changed in the span of moments. They felt it as they descended the narrow stairs. Above them, the feast hall's music had died. Bells rang from multiple towers now, out of rhythm, which meant different factions had seized different ropes. Footsteps thundered through distant corridors. Doors slammed, somewhere glass shattered. Somewhere a woman screamed and was cut off. The living castle carried sound strangely. Wood remembered vibration. Roots carried impact. The walls seemed to mutter with running feet. Cale held his sword before him the way old guard Hethrin had taught him, point low in the narrow stair, edge angled away from the wall. His shoulders were tense. His knuckles showed white. Elowen saw all this and felt a grief so sharp it nearly stole her breath. A boy should learn the weight of a tool before the weight of a weapon. Her son had once carved whistles from green twigs. He had once cried because a nest fell in a storm and 3 hatchlings died before he could put them back. He had once asked if trees were lonely because their roots touched but their branches reached in different directions. Now he moved down a servant stair with steel in his hand while royal blood began to make a country mad. The thought entered her, unwanted. Perhaps this was how nations ended. Not when kings died. Not when armies came. They ended when children were taught that the world had become a corridor where every corner might hold a knife. At the bottom of the stair, Tavin led them through a low passage smelling of onions, wet stone, and old smoke. The lower kitchens lay to their left. The pantries lay beyond. This part of High Root Castle had less beauty. The walls were root and stone, practical, damp, and crowded with hooks, barrels, crates, and side doors used by servants whose names never reached court songs. They heard voices ahead, men arguing. Elowen pulled the boys into an alcove behind stacked flour sacks. 3 guards passed carrying a chest between them. One wore Valor's shoulder knot, one wore Audrin's red hunting cord. The third had cut off his livery entirely. "That belongs in the treasury," the Velar man hissed. "The treasury belongs to whoever holds it when the king stops breathing," said the one with the red cord. "He may already be dead." "Then walk faster." The third guard laughed. They disappeared down the passage. Cale whispered, "They are robbing the castle." Elowen watched the empty corridor. "They are choosing tomorrow's master." That is theft. In a collapsing court, theft becomes preparation. He looked disgusted. She was glad. Disgust meant some part of him remained untrained by the castle. Tavin tugged her sleeve. This way. They reached the lower pantry door. It stood partly open. Inside, a lamp burned low. Barrels of apples lined one wall. Hanging herbs brushed the ceiling. Shelves held salted fish, seed cakes, vinegar jars, sealed crocks of butter, and sacks of rare winter grain from the northern treelands. The room smelled of food and fear. A girl sat tied to a chair near the back. Tavin's sister, Mira, 11 years old. Her mouth was gagged with cloth. Her eyes were wide and swollen from crying. Beside her stood one of Odrin's hunters, the same man who had grabbed the servant girl in the hall. He had removed his cloak. His knife was out. He was cutting slices from an apple and eating them slowly, as if the girl's terror improved the taste. He turned when they entered. For a moment, all five of them stared. Then he grinned. Well, he said, the little poison runner found friends. Kale lifted his sword. The hunter looked at the blade and laughed. Elowin moved first. She snatched a vinegar jar from the nearest shelf and hurled it at his face. It broke against his brow. He shouted, staggering, vinegar and blood streaming into his eyes. Kale rushed him. Too fast. The hunter, blinded but experienced, kicked a stool into Kale's legs. Kale fell hard, sword clattering against the floor. The hunter lunged toward him. Elowin grabbed a hanging hook from the wall, the kind used for meat, and swung it with both hands. It struck the hunter's cheek and tore skin. He screamed, turning on her with the knife. Tavin ran to his sister, fumbling with the ropes. Kale scrambled for his sword. The hunter came at Elowin. He was bigger, stronger, used to hurting people who had little power to answer. His knife flashed in the pantry light. Elowin backed into the shelves. A crock of butter smashed near her feet. He slashed and caught her sleeve, then skin. Pain opened along her forearm. Kale shouted. The hunter turned just as the boy struck. Kale's blade cut across the hunter's thigh. A shallow strike, but enough. The man stumbled. Elowin seized a sack of grain and shoved it into his face. He fell backward over the stool, cursing. Kale raised the sword with both hands. The hunter looked up. The boy hesitated. Elowin saw the hesitation. Saw the child inside him, horrified at the shape of a man beneath a blade. The hunter saw it too. He smiled through blood and vinegar. That's right, he said. You are not made for it. He reached for his knife. Elowin drove the meat hook into his hand and pinned it to the floorboards. His scream filled the pantry. Kale, she said, voice shaking but clear. Take Mira, now. Kale moved. Tavin freed the last knot. Mira fell into her brother's arms, sobbing against him. The hunter writhed, trying to tear his hand free. Elowin leaned close enough to smell vinegar on his breath. You grabbed girls because you thought the hall belonged to men like you, she said. Look at it now. It belongs to Ruin. She pulled the hook free. The hunter curled around his ruined hand. They left him there. Kale stared at her as they fled the pantry with Tavin and Mira. You did not kill him. I did not need to. He will tell others. Then we move faster. You sounded like the book. That struck her harder than she expected. The book beneath her cloak had begun to warm again, slightly as if danger had changed direction rather than passed. They took the lower passage toward Elowin's chamber, avoiding main stairs. Tavin carried Mira when her legs failed. Kale walked behind them now, sword red at the edge. He kept looking at it. Elowin wanted to take it from him, clean it, hide it, turn back the hour. Instead, she kept moving. They passed beneath a root arch carved with the old royal motto, one crown, one root, one cedrular. Someone had smeared a handprint across it in blood. Kale saw. One root, he muttered. Elowin remembered another passage from the book. She spoke it softly, partly to him, partly to herself. Beware the root that praises oneness while feeding upon buried bodies. A kingdom may call itself one thing because it fears how many hungers live beneath it. Kale looked at her. Did the book say that about Cedrular? The book rarely names the place it means. Then how do you know? Because tonight Cedrular is answering. They reached a low and small chamber in the east servants' wing. The room held a narrow bed, a chest, a wash basin, 2 hooks, and a tiny window overlooking the herb yard. Humble things, blessed things, things that did not ask for blood. She moved quickly. From the chest, she took a travel cloak, 2 wrapped loaves, dried pears, a water skin, a small pouch of coin, and the old green cloth in which her mother had once kept the book. She checked the hidden stitching where she had sewn 3 emergency needles, a sliver of flint, and a folded scrap containing the names of her dead. Cale watched her. You always kept that ready. Yes. For this? For many possible endings. Taven stood in the doorway with Mira clinging to him. Come with us, Elowen said. The boy shook his head. My mother. Elowen's hand stilled. Taven. She is in the kitchens. She will look for us there. The kitchens are not safe. She will look. Mira sobbed. I want mother. Elowen looked at Cale. He looked back, and for the first time that night, he understood a choice before she spoke it. They could not search the whole castle. Every corridor cost breath. Every delay tightened the trap. The book had warned by cold, by symbols, by the stag's silent gaze. Elowen could feel the old command pressing against her ribs. Gather what blood remains yours. Leave. But Mira's small fingers gripped Taven's sleeve. Taven's jaw shook with the effort to be brave. Elowen crossed the room and placed one hand on his cheek. Listen to me. Take Mira through the herb yard. Go to the ash gate by the beekeeper's shed. If your mother lives and can flee, she will know that path. Hide in the ditch beyond the west orchard until dawn. If we survive, we will find you there. You promise? Elowen hated promises made in collapsing houses. I will try with everything I have. Taven nodded, though tears slipped down his face. Cale took one of the loaves and handed it to him. Taven accepted it with the solemnity of a holy gift. Then the siblings left through the small window because the corridor had become too loud. Elowen watched them drop into the herb yard and run bent back beneath the mist. Cale stood beside her. You sent them alone. I sent them away from us. Why? Because the book is with us. He understood after a moment, and fear touched his face again. You think it draws danger? I think danger notices what survives. Behind them, bells continued to ring. A horn sounded from the northern tower, then another from the lower gate. The castle was not warning the kingdom now. It was calling factions inward. Elowen wrapped the book in its green cloth and bound it beneath her cloak more securely. For a moment she looked down at the old cover. The True Kings of Matter. The title was not written in ink, it was pressed into the leather in letters that seemed deeper than the cover should allow. When she was small, she had traced them with one finger and asked why kings needed a book if they were true. Her mother had answered, perhaps the book is not for them. Then who? For those standing beneath the table when kings begin eating each other. Elowen had laughed then, her mother had not. Now Cale stood beside her with a sword too new for the blood on it. The joke had finally reached its meaning. They left the chamber. The servants' wing had changed while they were inside. 2 women ran past carrying bundles. An old man limped behind them, clutching a silver candlestick under his coat. Farther down the corridor, 2 guards argued over whether to seal the east stair. One shoved the other. The shove became a punch. The punch became a knife drawn halfway from a belt. Elowen pulled Cale back before either saw them. Other way. The garden door is east. The east is becoming teeth. They turned south toward the old portrait passage. It was longer but less used during feasts because nobles disliked passing under ancestral paintings in poor light. Elowen had always thought that and said something about them. The passage smelled of dust and cedar oil. Painted kings lined the walls, each framed in branch gold, each holding a symbol of rain. One held a seed bowl, one held a spear, one held a law scroll, one held a dead wolf by the scruff. One queen, the only woman painted with the crown rather than beside it, held a child and a dagger. Cale slowed before her portrait. Who was she? Queen Mareth of the First Thinning. What did she do? Saved the capital from famine by opening royal stores. That sounds good. She also hanged every granary lord who refused her. Cale studied the painted face. Was she good? Elowen looked at the queen's eyes, painted centuries before, calm above the child and dagger. She was necessary. People often confuse that with good when they are hungry enough. The words seemed to settle in Cale. At the far end of the passage, the wall shook. Dust fell from the beams. A muffled blast rolled through the castle. Not magic, not a siege engine. Powder from the old armory, perhaps? Sedrilar had little modern weaponry compared to other Vorengard nations, but noble houses collected foreign things for pride. Fire powder, alchemical charges, door breakers. Tools meant to scare enemies and impress allies until someone desperate remembered they could open stone and flesh alike. Cale gripped his sword. Elwyn moved faster. They reached the portrait of King Lethrin, Thavrin's grandfather. His painted hand rested on a stag-headed scepter. At the bottom of the frame, the old royal phrase had been carved. The forest witnesses the crown. Elwyn stopped. Cale looked at her. What? She stared at the phrase. The forest witnesses the crown. Witnesses. The word turned inside her. The stag had stood outside the hall. It had watched the claimants, the king, the cups, the old chief, the hidden poison, the boy with the tray, the clerk with a knife, the servant girl grabbed by a hunter, the crown hunger moving through every mouth. Witness was not an innocent word. Witnesses did not need to strike. A witness made an act permanent. A witness carried truth beyond denial. A witness stood between crime and forgetting. Was that what the stag was? A witness? Or did mortals behave worse beneath watching eyes because they mistook attention for permission? Mother? Elwyn touched the book under her cloak. Your grandmother once told me something. I did not understand it. Cale waited. She said the archons may be judges, but if they are, they judge by arriving after the sentence has already been written. Cale looked disturbed. Who writes it? Elwyn turned from the portrait. We do. They continued. At last they reached a narrow stair that descended toward the lower garden. A single lamp burned at the landing. The air smelled fresher here, touched by wet leaves and soil. For the first time since the stag appeared, Elwyn allowed herself to believe they might reach open ground. Then a voice came from below. Gate is barred. Another answered, by whose order? Valor's. Valor does not hold the lower garden. He does if his men hold the key. Elwyn cursed under her breath. Cale looked at her, startled. She rarely cursed. Two guards stood below. Their armor bore different loyalties. One wore Valor's green shoulder knot, the other wore Sarion's white ribbon at the wrist. They stood too close to each other, hands near weapons, trapped between orders. Elwyn stepped back from the stair. We cannot pass them, Cale whispered. We could wait. For one to kill the other? He said nothing. The answer had already entered him. A scream rose from somewhere in the castle, long and raw. A woman's scream, then men shouting, then furniture breaking. The two guards below heard it. The Sirion guard looked up the stair. Elwyn pulled Cale into shadow. Too late. Who's there? The guard called. Cale's breathing changed. Elwyn took his face in both hands and whispered, Do not draw unless he reaches for me. The boy nodded once. The guard climbed the stair. His boots struck wood slowly. Behind him, the Valor guard said, Leave it. We hold the door. The Sarion guard ignored him. He reached the landing and lifted his lamp. Elwyn bowed. Forgive us, sir. We were sent to fetch herbs from the lower beds for the king's chamber. The guard looked at her, then at Cale's sword, then at her cloak, where the book made the fabric sit slightly wrong. His gaze sharpened. What is under your cloak? My winter wrap. Open it. Cale's hand twitched. Elwyn felt the moment tilt. Then from below, the Valor guard shouted, Ren! The Sarian guard turned. The other man had drawn steel. Accusation did not need words. Perhaps one had seen the other's wrist ribbon. Perhaps old rivalry surfaced. Perhaps the castle had simply taught them that delay meant death. The Sarian guard ran down. Steel struck steel below. Elwyn pulled Cale away from the landing. They took the only remaining path, a crawl corridor behind the herb-drying chamber, built for children and thin servants. Elwyn had used it once to hide from a drunken lord who liked closing doors behind women. She had been younger then. The corridor now felt narrower, damp against her shoulders. Cale crawled behind her, sword awkward in one hand. The passage descended, turned, and opened behind a lattice of roots near the lower garden wall. Elwyn pushed aside the loose panel. Cold air touched her face. The garden lay beyond, silvered by mist and lantern spill. Rows of herbs bent under rain. Low hedges shaped like kneeling deer bordered the path. The lower garden door stood across the yard, set into the outer wall beneath an arch of living roots. Two bodies lay near it, the guards from the stair. Both had made it down by some other way or fallen through the conflict before them. One lay face down in the mud. The other sat against the wall, hands pressed uselessly over his belly. He looked up as Elowen and Kale emerged. "Help!" he said. The word was small. Kale took a step toward him. Elowen stopped him. The wounded guard saw the refusal forming and began to cry. "Help!" he said. The word was small. Kale took a step toward him. Elowen stopped him. The wounded guard saw the refusal forming and began to cry. "Please." Elowen hated herself. She hated the book. She hated kings. She hated every polished spoon in the hall above them. The guard's eyes moved to Kale. "Boy, please." Kale looked at his mother. The book beneath her cloak seemed unbearably heavy. A passage surfaced inside her, unbidden. The stag does not make the knife. It finds the feast where knives have already been hidden. It does not choose who is spared. It watches what mercy can afford after power has spent the world. Elowen knelt at the guard's side. She did not know him. He was young, perhaps 20. Sarion's white ribbon was tied around his wrist. His blood darkened it. "I cannot carry you," she said. He gripped her sleeve. "Then stay." She looked toward the garden door. Beyond it lay the path to the outer trees. Beyond that, perhaps survival. "I have my son." "I have a mother," he whispered. Kale flinched. Elowen closed her eyes. This was the cruelty of endings. They made every life argue against every other. She took the water skin from her shoulder and placed it in the guard's hands. "I am sorry." He looked at the water, then at her. For one instant, anger entered his face, hot and pure. Then it broke into terror again. Elowen rose. Kale stared at her as if waiting for an explanation that could make the choice clean. She had none to give. They crossed the garden. The key shook in Elowen's hand as she unlocked the lower door. Behind them, the wounded guard began to pray, then cough, then sob without words. Kale's face had changed. "Mother," he said. "I know. We left him." "I know. He asked us." "I know." They stepped through the door. Outside Hyrule Castle, the royal forest waited. For a moment, the night seemed almost peaceful. Rain softened the world. Cedars rose in black columns. Ferns shivered under drops. The ground smelled alive, rich with soil and roots. Then Kale looked left. The stag stood among the trees. Closer now, its dark body half hidden behind a cedar trunk. Its antlers rose into the branches. Its eyes burned green and purple, steady as sacred fire contained inside flesh. Kale inhaled sharply. Elowen froze. The stag looked at them. Not at the castle, at them. The book under Elowen's cloak warmed suddenly, as if held near a living heart. The stag did not speak. It only watched. Kale slowly lifted his sword. Elowen placed her hand over his and lowered it. "Do not. It is looking at us." "Yes." "Why?" Elowen opened the book with trembling fingers. She had not meant to. There, under rain and cedar boughs, with the lower garden door still open behind them, and the wounded guard dying within earshot, she opened the green wrapping and parted the dark cover. The pages turned by themselves. Not quickly, not violently. One page lifted, another. Then the book settled. The letters were darker than before. Elowen read aloud, because the old training took hold, and because Kale needed words to stand between him and wonder. "When the stag of green and purple sight stands beneath the noble trees, let the bearer mark the hour. A nation does not rot because it is watched. It is watched when rot has reached the crown." Kale listened, eyes fixed on the creature. Elowen continued, "The watcher's gaze is not the knife. The gaze is the end of pretending the knife was never drawn." The rain fell harder. The stag's eyes burned through it. Behind them, inside Hyrule Castle, the bells rang again. This time the pattern was clear. Death bell. Royal death bell. Once for the crown, once for the root, once for Cedrilar. The sound rolled through the forest. The stag turned its head toward the castle. Elowen shut the book. Kale whispered, "The king?" "Perhaps. Before dawn." "Yes." He said he would name the heir before dawn. Elowen looked back at the garden door. She thought of the wounded guard, the poison cup, the hall full of claimants, Chief Arveth with his old blood oath, Odrin's slap, Valor's patience, Sarion's smile, Elira's clerk with the hidden knife. The king had promised an heir before dawn. Dawn had become unnecessary. The nation would name many now, each with blood. "We have to go," she said. They moved along the outer wall, keeping to the trees. Elowen knew a path that curved behind the old falcon mews and down toward the western orchard. From there, if fortune held, they could reach the beekeeper's ditch where Tavin and Mira might be hiding. After that, the lower road through the moss fields, then perhaps the south cottages, then perhaps beyond Cedralar's claim entirely. Perhaps. The word walked with her like a second shadow. As they moved, Kale looked back again and again. The stag remained near the lower garden, watching Highroot Castle. With each step, the castle seemed less like a palace and more like a living creature in pain. Lights moved behind windows. Figures ran across balconies. A plume of smoke rose from the western kitchens. The bells kept sounding until some tower faction cut the rope or killed the ringer. In the silence that followed, a new sound emerged. Shouting from the city below. Not panic alone. Rage. The feast had cracked the royal house, but the crack was already traveling outward. Through servants, through guards, through messengers, through old claims waiting in noble trunks, through tribal chiefs who had arrived armed, through every man who had ever believed he deserved more than the branch he was given. Kale heard it too. "It is spreading." Elowen did not answer. In the book, the stag belonged to succession, inheritance, ambition, noble betrayal, poisoned feasts, heirs turning against family, crowns changing hands, and kingdoms rotting inward. But books, even sacred and cursed ones, made horrors sound neat by naming them. Real rot spread in directions names could not control. A prince died and a pantry girl lost her safety. A king weakened and boys were given swords. A crown went unnamed and a servant corridor filled with poison. A noble insulted another noble, and a wounded guard begged a widow to spend her son's life on mercy. The royal family would be blamed, and rightly, but the sickness had roots far beyond their table. Cedralar had trained generations to worship bloodlines. Now blood had become argument. It would not stop at the castle. They reached the western orchard. Tavin and Mira were not in the ditch. Elowen found the half-loaf first. It lay in the wet grass, torn open. Kale saw it and looked around wildly. "Tavin?" Elowen raised a hand for silence. The orchard stretched before them, rows of old fruit trees whose branches had been grafted over centuries to bear rare green gold apples, used only for royal ceremonies. Tonight, many of the fruits had fallen early. They lay split in the mud, pale flesh exposed, seeds scattered like tiny black teeth. A sound came from behind the third row, a muffled cry. Kale moved before Elowen could stop him. He ran between the trees, sword drawn. Elowen followed, heart striking hard. They found Mira first. She was alive, hidden beneath a low branch, one hand over her mouth. Her eyes widened when she saw Elowen. She pointed deeper into the orchard. Two men stood there with Tavin between them. They were not guards, stable hands perhaps, or lower soldiers stripped of livery. One held Tavin by the hair, the other searched his pockets. Both smelled of wine even from several paces away. "Where'd you get royal bread?" one demanded. Tavin tried to answer, but the man shook him. Kale stepped into view. "Let him go." The men turned. Elowen nearly cried out. The first man laughed. "Another little sword." Kale's face went pale, but he held the blade up. "I said let him go." The second man shoved Tavin to the ground. "What house are you for, boy?" Kale hesitated. The question had become deadly in the span of 1 hour. Elowen stepped beside him. "He is for his mother." The first man grinned. "Wrong house tonight." He lunged at Kale with a pruning blade. Kale parried badly, metal scraping metal. The force drove him back. The second man moved toward Elowen. Mira screamed. Elowen grabbed a fallen branch, heavy with rain, and swung for the man's knee. It struck hard enough to make him stumble. Tavin threw himself at the man's legs, biting like an animal. The man cursed and kicked him away. Kale fought the first man between the trees. The orchard made the fight strange. Branches caught sleeves. Mud betrayed feet. Fallen fruit crushed under heels, slick and sweet. Kale's training had been in a dry yard with old Hethrin tapping corrections against his shins. This was fear, rain, and a man who wanted to live by hurting him. The pruning blade slashed Kale's cheek. He cried out, more startled than wounded. Elwyn saw blood on her son's face. Something old and terrible rose in her. She drove the branch into the second man's throat, then again into his temple when he bent choking. He fell into the mud. Cal backed against an apple tree. The first man raised his pruning blade. Tavin grabbed a fallen fruit and threw it. It struck the man's ear. Useless almost. But his head turned. Kale thrust. The sword entered the man's belly. The man made a sound like surprise. Kale let go of the blade. The man dropped to his knees with it still in him. The orchard went still except for rain. Kale stared. Elwyn rushed to him. "Are you cut deep?" He did not answer. She touched the wound on his cheek. Shallow. Bleeding enough to frighten, not enough to endanger. "Kale, I stabbed him. He would have killed you. I let go." "That does not matter. I let go of the sword." She held his face. "Look at me." He did, but his eyes kept trying to slide toward the man kneeling in the mud. "Look at me," she said again. He obeyed. "You are alive. Tavin is alive. Mira is alive. We move." "My sword." Elwyn looked at the man. He had fallen onto his side now, hands around the blade. She had to make another choice. The sword was their only weapon. Leaving it meant less blood on Kale's hands now, perhaps death later. Keeping it meant asking him to pull it from a body. She looked at Tavin. "Take Mira to the ditch. Stay low." The boy nodded, shaking. Elwyn went to the fallen man. He was still breathing. His eyes rolled toward her. She did not know what she felt. Hate, pity, disgust, exhaustion, all braided together. "I am sorry," she whispered, and hated those words too. She put her foot against his coat, gripped the sword, and pulled. The sound stayed with her. She wiped the blade on wet grass and returned it to Kale. He stared at it. "I cannot. You can carry it without loving it. I do not want it." "I know. I do not want any of this." Elwyn's throat tightened. "Good." He looked at her confused. She pressed the hilt into his hand. "Wanting it would frighten me more." Above the orchard, a horn sounded from the city. Then another answered from the northern road. The factions were calling. High Root Castle burned brighter behind the trees. The stag stood on the ridge between castle and orchard. Its body was a dark shape in the rain. Its antlers caught pale light. Its eyes glowed green and purple. Watching the orchard, the mother, the son, the dead men, the saved children, the sword returned to a boy's hand. Elwyn felt a wild urge to shout at it, to demand meaning, to ask whether this was protection or torment, to ask why the book had saved her family only by leading them through other people's deaths. The stag did not move. Kale saw it. "Does it care?" The question was so soft Elwyn almost missed it. She looked at the archon beneath the ridge trees. "I do not know if care is a word large enough for what it does." "That sounds like something people say when they mean it does not." "Perhaps." He wiped rain and blood from his cheek with the heel of his hand. "I hate perhaps." "So do I." Tavin and Mira waited in the ditch, clinging to each other. Elwyn gave them the rest of the bread and told them again where to go, which path to take, where to hide if riders came, how to find the charcoal burners beyond the south fields if dawn came red. Tavin asked if she would come with them now. Elwyn looked toward the castle. She should have said yes. Instead, the book shifted under her cloak. Not cold this time. Heavy, as if some page inside had turned without opening. She understood with dread that chapter 1 of the night had not finished with her. The lower roads would already be watched. The south path might be full of soldiers. The city would be worse. Her best chance might be the old route passage beneath the chapel hill, a forgotten way out used during the Elder Wars. To reach it, she would have to skirt the castle grounds and pass near the royal grove. Near the stag. She looked at Taven and Mira. You go south. Do not wait for us. Mira began to cry again. Taven nodded like someone much older and much smaller than he had been an hour before. They parted in the orchard. Kale watched them vanish into the wet trees. Will they live? Elowin thought of the 8 copies, of protection that warned, hid, guided, and still demanded terrible roads. I hope so. That is different from perhaps. Yes. Is hope better? Elowin looked at the distant stag. Its eyes burned green and purple in the dark. I do not know, she said, but it hurts differently. They moved toward the royal grove. The path climbed through ancient cedars where the ground was soft and black. High Root Castle loomed to their right, half palace, half forest beast, windows blazing with unrest. Smoke rose from one wing. Figures ran along the outer wall. Somewhere inside, a group began chanting Valar's name. Another group answered with Odrin's. Then a third, farther away, cried for Arveth and the northern claim. Sedrilar had become many mouths. Each mouth wanted a crown. At the edge of the royal grove, Elowin stopped. The old trees stood in a circle, their trunks braided with carved bands of silver, green glass, and ancient bone. This was where kings came before coronation. This was where heirs knelt, where royal infants were presented to the forest, where dead rulers rested one night before burial. Servants were forbidden unless summoned. Elowin had entered once, years ago, to carry mourning cloths after the queen's death. She had disliked the place then. It was too beautiful, too aware of itself. Tonight the grove felt awake. Kale whispered, "We should not be here." No! The word came before she could stop it, but she did not repeat it. She moved on. At the center of the grove stood the crown root cedar. The tree was enormous, its trunk wider than a cottage, its bark pale and ridged like old skin. The first crown of Sedrilar was said to have been carved from a branch that fell from it during a blood-red dawn. The royal family claimed their right came through that tree. The tribes claimed the tree belonged to all Sedrilar before kings placed guards around it. The priests claimed the tree listened only to vows. The poor claimed nothing because claims required witnesses with power. Beneath the crown root cedar, someone had placed a bowl of wine. Fresh, a ritual offering. Beside it lay a crown of green twigs. Elowin approached slowly. The bowl's surface reflected the sky, not the cloudy night above. A black moon. Kale saw it too. There is no moon tonight. There is now, Elowin whispered. The reflection did not ripple in the rain. The book opened beneath her cloak. She felt it. The cover parted. Pages shifted against her body like something breathing. With trembling hands, she drew it out. Kale did not tell her to stop. The page had already found itself. Elowin read, "Above the 7 is the patient one, the cold maker, the lord of weight and hunger, the demiurge beneath the black moon. He need not strike the stone when stone remembers falling. He need not command blood when blood remembers inheritance. He need only watch long enough for matter to confess its first desire." Kale's face had gone very still. What is matter's first desire? Elowin stared at the words. I do not know. But she feared she did. To gather, to hold, to consume, to become more of itself at the cost of what stood beside it. A crown was matter shaped into permission. A blade was matter shaped into decision. A castle was matter shaped into rank. A book was matter shaped into memory. A body was matter shaped into hunger, fear, love, and violence, all trapped together and asked to choose. Behind them, a branch cracked. Kale spun, soared up. The stag stood at the edge of the grove. Closer than before, its hooves made almost no sound on the wet ground. Its body remained dark, real, touched by rain. Its antlers lifted into the cedar boughs. Its eyes held the green and purple blaze, steady and immense, like colored fires set behind the gaze of something that had watched thousands of crowns rise and sink. It looked at the bowl, at the twig crown, at Elowin's book, at Kale's sword, then at High Root Castle. The bells began again. This time they were joined by screams from the city. Elowin felt the pattern closing. The stag had appeared at the feast. The poison had moved. The crown had trembled. The claimants had spoken. The servants had begun to die for choices made above them. The children had been pulled into the roots. The black moon had shown itself where the sky had not placed it. Sedrilar's time had come, not because the stag commanded it, because Sedrilar had prepared itself across generations, polishing ambition until it looked like duty, teaching inheritance until blood became law, planting pride so deeply into the royal trees that every branch believed itself the trunk. The stag was the moment the kingdom could no longer pretend its beauty was innocence. Kale lowered his sword a fraction. "Mother," he whispered. "Yes. If it speaks, should we listen?" Elowyn looked at the archon. The stag's gaze was unbearable, yet she could not look away. "If it speaks," she said, "we remember every word and trust none of our comfort." The stag did not speak. Instead, it turned from them and walked deeper into the grove, toward the side path that curved along the old root passage beneath the chapel hill. A path Elowyn had not yet chosen aloud. Kale watched it. "It wants us to follow." "Want may be too human." "It knows the way." "Yes." "Is that protection?" Elowyn thought of the 8 copies again, of families spared through warning, of her own dead who had protected the book until it came to her, of the hunter in the pantry with his hand ruined, of the guard by the lower door begging her to stay, of the man in the orchard dying with Kale's sword in his belly, of Tabin and Mira disappearing into rain. Protection. The word looked different after one counted what it passed through. She wrapped the book again. "We follow at a distance." They entered the grove after the stag. Behind them, High Root Castle glowed through the trees, green banners whipping from its towers, smoke crawling upward, royal windows bright with movement and killing. The castle looked beautiful still. That was the worst of it. Its living walls had not become ugly because men within them had. The rare tree lands did not wither out of pity. The cedar boughs held rain as gently as ever. The fruit still smelled sweet where they split in the mud. Beauty did not save Sedrilar. Perhaps beauty had helped hide the rot. Elowyn and Kale moved between the ancient trees while the stag's eyes shone ahead of them, green and purple, appearing and vanishing between trunks. At the edge of the grove, Elowyn looked back once. Through a high window in the castle, she saw figures struggling near the royal table. One raised a blade, another fell. The white feast cloth had been torn down and dragged across the floor like a surrender flag trampled before anyone accepted it. Above the highest branches, the clouds thinned. Something round and black seemed to wait behind them. Kale saw her looking. "Is that the black moon?" Elowyn forced herself to turn away. "Do not give it your full gaze." "Why?" "Because the book says some things notice being noticed." They followed the stag into the deeper dark, and behind them, Sedrilar began to name its heirs in blood.